All right, folks, let's get going. Thank you for your patience. A little bit late, that's not too bad. So welcome to Why Don't the Poor Rise Up? Organizing the 21st Century Resistance. My name is Alex Khasnabish. I'm a professor here at Mount St. Vincent University, and I direct the Radical Imagination Project. I'd like to thank you all for coming. First thing I'd like to do is just to begin this event, as we always do, by acknowledging this event and our lives here are taking place on unceded, unsurrendered Mi'kmaq territory. And for those of you in the room who are settlers like me, I'd just like to take the opportunity to acknowledge our collective responsibility to decolonize our presences and our lives here and to learn to live with justice and dignity with the first inhabitants of these territories. I'm going to keep my introductory comments very short. We have some wonderful folks to hear from tonight. I'd just like to say that this event is kind of two things put together. This event is an opportunity for me to bring together some of the wonderful organizers, activists, thinkers, educators who I've been working with over the past year in a little project called For the Long Haul Initiative. It's a research project that has rolled out of the Radical Imagination Project. Basically what we did was we went around and interviewed some of the most experienced activists and organizers in and around Halifax about their best lessons for future generations of social justice activists and organizers. So some of their biggest hits, some of their most lamentable misses, all that kind of stuff, and we're trying to bring together some of that knowledge and circulate it back to movements. This is an opportunity to do that with all of you in the room. So I've actually invited 6 of them here. One of them is missing right now. We're still hopeful she will show up. I'm going to introduce them in just a second, but that will be the panel event for tonight. So I've asked them all to prepare comments and just to think around this topic of why don't the poor rise up, which many of you are probably wondering, why did we title the event that? Well, it is actually the title of this book, Why Don't the Poor Rise Up, just released by AK Press, and edited by, one of the editors is actually with us tonight. Michael Truscello is here, and he's going to say a few words about the book first. I'm very proud to have a little chapter in this book, but I'm trying not to engage in too much of the odious self-promotion, so I won't say anything more than that. We think the book is really useful and really important, though, and brings together a lot of folks from all around the world, actually, who are activists, organizers, and thinkers with social movements who've reflected on this question. The title of the book actually isn't really ours. It came out of an op-ed written a couple of years ago in the Washington Post?
New York Times.
New York Times. I always say New York Times and I always think I'm wrong. So it was the New York Times. And Michael will talk more about that, but this book, it kind of takes up that challenge, which is often uttered by liberals, right? It's kind of like this lament to like, why don't the oppressed and the exploited save us from ourselves and just rise up and change it all, right? I'm middle class, I have too much to lose. So this is an opportunity, I think, to reflect critically on that in this dangerous time that we're living in right now. So I'm really very honored to have been asked to contribute to the book and really, really excited about it. I'm so happy that Michael could join us here. So without any further ado, I want to just do some introductions and then turn it over to Michael. I've asked the panelists to speak for about 8 minutes each, which is an odd amount of time, but keeps it short for the number of people we have. And then we're going to open things up to a moderated discussion afterwards. So your comments and questions, and the only thing I would ask right now, and I'll remind you about that later, is when you do have an opportunity to talk, and I'm just going to say this to all our panelists, please project, because we don't have good speakers in this room and we don't have mics, so obviously we want everybody to be able to hear. And for those of you asking questions similarly, can you just make sure you stand up and let yourself be heard. And just one more plug. Of course, we have lots more events on tap this fall for the Radical Imagination Project. If you don't already follow us on Facebook, please do, or check out our website, which is radicalimagination.org. Thank you again for joining us. I'm going to do my introductions and then get out of the way. So Michael Truscello is an associate professor at Mount Royal University in the Department of English. Michael's also an organizer and activist in anti-authoritarian and anti-capitalist scenes, and he's here tonight as in his capacity as editor of this book. And to talk to you about some of the key terms and ideas in the book, as well as what the project is. And then I'm just going to go down the table in order, and make this quick. So many of you know these wonderful folks already, but I'll provide short introductions for those of you who don't. We have Jackie Barkley here tonight. Jackie is a longtime social justice activist and organizer, social worker in the city. She's also a member of Solidarity Halifax. We're so pleased to have Jackie with us. She's been engaged. We have engaged Jackie in her wisdom through the Radical Imagination Project at least twice, and she still puts up with me, so I thank Jackie for that. Of course, we have Lynn Jones here with us too. Lynn is a longtime educator, activist, social justice worker in this city. I'm so pleased to have had the opportunity as well to have visited her archive now down at St. Mary's. Lynn's archive is an amazing resource on the African Nova Scotian experience and the diaspora. If you haven't had a chance to check it out, please do. I have my students down there right now working with the archive, and it's an amazing resource. We, of course, have Elle Jones with us. Elle is the newest Nancy's Chair in Women's and Gender Studies here at Mount St. Vincent University. She is the former Poet Laureate of Halifax. She is an absolutely tireless force for social justice and social change in the city and beyond, and has many more accolades than that. I'm sure you've heard her poetry, spoken word before. We have Ardath Whynacht. Ardath is an artist, an activist, an educator, a professor at Mount Allison University in the Department of Sociology, and has similarly put up with the Radical Imagination Project and all our many requests over the years, and still hangs out with me once in a while, which is great. And we have Brad Fougere. And Brad is an anti-capitalist, anti-authoritarian organizer, activist here in the city. Brad is a member of the Industrial Workers of the World and a member of Autonomy East. And those are the only affiliations we will mention publicly right now. Just kidding. So thank you very much, folks. I will try and keep my best to keep you all to time. So just look for my polite cues, and I'm here to turn it over to Michael first.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you very much for coming out this evening. It's an honor to be here with my co-panelists, and it's a real pleasure to see this number of people in a room to talk about radical politics. I come from Calgary. Somebody literally asked me in one of the first presentations I gave there, what am I doing in Calgary? And I think that sort of set the tone for the time that I would spend there. So this is really a great pleasure to see so many people here to talk about this particular issue, this question. I should be clear that the question, why don't the poor rise up, is not intended as accusatory. It's not saying what's wrong with the poor. No, not at all. What we did was we asked, my co-editor and I asked people from around the world to respond to the question in the sense of looking at the obstacles to popular insurrection. What are some of those obstacles? What are some of the ways that people are overcoming those obstacles? So how can we take this perennial question in revolutionary thought and apply it to this moment right now and what people are actually doing? So we looked in particular for people who were active in organizing. So not just the most clever idea, but people who had experience and could speak to that experience. That's what was our primary interest. And I just want to take this moment to express solidarity with George Tickerell-Lamar, who blurbed our book and was recently placed on administrative leave at Drexel University because the far right-wing hate machine, through the Daily Caller in particular, basically attacked him for some of the things that he was expressing in terms of anti-racist politics. So there is a kind of creeping fascism of that kind, and I'm sure you're aware of it. And so let's see what are some of the things we can do to respond. Initially, what kind of was the impetus for this collection was a New York Times op-ed by the Columbia professor Thomas B. Edsel asking the question, why don't the poor rise up? And he gave a kind of typical liberal response to it. You know, he said the problem is that the poor are not an important constituent to the Democratic or the Republican Party, and therefore, you know, they're not going to get any attention from the political elite. This, of course, is not at all surprising, since those two capitalist political parties have no interest in helping the poor. They never will. And as anarchists, we don't look to electoral politics to solve those problems. But this was his answer. What caught my attention in particular was the fact that even Edsel was referencing other op-eds in capitalist media. So the Economist ran a similar question, expressing this surprise that they're not receiving more resistance to the kind of unprecedented exploitation that we see, especially in the wake of the 2008 crisis. I think this is the context in which they are writing these op-eds, is we can't believe that we just perpetrated the largest fraud in history, and we're not seeing even more forms of revolt in American streets in particular, but this question has been asked by capitalist media abroad as well. So it's that specific, you know, the fact that capitalist media are saying this openly was what caught my attention. The question itself is always on the minds of revolutionary thinkers. So we asked people from around the world to respond to this question and gave them a good amount of freedom to interrogate all aspects of the question. What does it mean to be poor? What does it mean to rise up? So one of our authors talked about the election of Trump in terms of a kind of rising up, but in the form of fascist politics. So sometimes, in fact, historically, most of the time, the poor will rise up in a fascistic way in order to acquire their material needs and desires and so forth. So it's actually, you know, it's less often that you find the alternative, the far left kind of revolution in ascendance. Here in Canada, you know, I'll start out just by identifying some sort of economic trends that I'm sure you are familiar with. This is, you know, the obvious fact that in recent years, most of the so-called wealth that's being acquired off the backs of working people is being accumulated by not just the rich, but actually the top, you know, 1% of the 1% are where most of the gains are. And this is the same in the United States. So we can see this gap between the rich and everyone else expanding dramatically. We have, you know, the numbers to show this, that the richest 8 billionaires have as much wealth as the poorest half of the human population. This is, and I want to put this in the context of capitalists and through the United Nations Millennium Goal of having poverty worldwide and eliminating, they said by 2025, I believe it is, they wanted to eliminate extreme poverty. And of course, they're nowhere near doing that, and it's not, you know, it can't be done under capitalism because that's not the purpose of capitalism and how it works. So what you tend to see in those official organs are official estimates of how many poor people there are that reduce the number, that try to diminish the actual number, and I'll show you an example in a moment. But poverty, extreme poverty, is, for one thing, a form of violence. You know, think about in recent days the number of capitalist media discussions of gun control, for example. Compare that to the number of mainstream media discussions of extreme poverty. You will hear almost nothing about extreme poverty, even though it prematurely kills in the United States over 880,000 people annually, more than guns, car accidents, and tobacco combined. So it gives you a sense of the priorities of certain media. The typical numbers that governments use to describe the poverty line tend to diminish the actual number of people living in poverty. And I'm not going to go through all of the studies that do this, but some of the studies show that the actual number, for example, in the United States, of people living in poverty are about 160% to 170% higher than the official figure. So by one anti-poverty group's estimate, the poverty line in the US for a family of 4 should be about $46,000 in annual income. The US government poverty line, by contrast, is about $24,000. So they dramatically understate what it means to live in poverty. The World Health Organization calls extreme poverty the world's most ruthless killer. One of the things that these income levels tend to do is mask structural forms of oppression. So the general sense is, if you are somehow earning above that poverty line in annual income, you're fine. Everything is fine. You are not living in poverty, right? And that ignores structural forms of racism, sexism, ableism, and other forms of structural oppression, because it gets hidden by a number. So even if you're a few dollars above, the annual income number for the poverty line, does that somehow mean that your job is not humiliating, or that you are not subject to structural oppressions like racism and sexism and so forth? So the number, first of all, is one way that it really doesn't capture what it means to be poor. The other myth is the idea here that capitalism can somehow cure poverty. We have this thing in Calgary where they announced several years ago they were going to end poverty in the city. And every few years they update, how they're doing on that front. It's an absurdity, because the system, the economic system that dominates, is not driven by creating some kind of equality, by distributing wealth evenly or anything like that. Of course it's not. Capitalism functions by creating poverty. You cannot solve it by using more capitalism. But this is what leaders will do when Obama went to the United Nations, for example. He said, that capitalism was going to solve poverty. This is the sort of standard line. It is when we look at, for example, the housing crisis. In the United States, there's something like 6 empty homes for every homeless person. In Ireland, a recent study said there are 13 empty homes for every homeless person. You can find similar statistics across a number of countries. And this shouldn't be a surprise at all. This is something that is systematically produced by capitalism in making houseless lives, right? This is not a kind of accident, a residual effect or something like that. It is the primary effect of a capitalist economy. So we can't solve poverty with capitalism. A third major myth that gets repeated, especially in Canada, every election cycle you will hear this: we've got to restore the middle class. All of the political parties are all about saving the middle class, restoring the middle class. This is one of those definitions that obscures the fact that we live in a society with a majority working class. If everyone continues to believe that they are either on the cusp of or in the middle class and therefore being served by these political parties, then they are less likely to identify as working class people, less likely to fight back appropriately. This was in the Globe and Mail just a few days ago. This might surprise some of you. Apparently, if you make about $25,000 a year, you are in the middle class in Canada. I bet you didn't know that. Between $25,000 and $42,000 a year, shows you just how great the divide is between haves and have-nots. That is the middle. That's the so-called middle class in that earning range. And of course, it also demonstrated how the 1% have accumulated most of the wealth in recent years. We also have to be cognizant of structural racism in poverty in Canada. There are many structural forms that poverty takes. One of them is racism. Of course, living in a colonial settler culture means that you have a kind of systemic cause for the impoverishment of First Nations, and that represents that sort of becomes familiar to us in a number of forms of violence against the people living in that and under that condition. I wasn't sure how far to go. If we have a minute, okay? So, if there's time, I'll talk about some of the other chapters in the book. It's kind of impossible to represent all of them because there are about 18. But one of them is by Prabha Pilar, who is a diasporic Colombian artist, and Alex Wilson, who is an academic at the University of Saskatchewan, and she's also an organizer with Idle No More. One of their concerns is in approaching this question, first of all, like many of the contributors, they said, the poor are fighting back, and it's sort of like almost defensive. And yes, that is absolutely the case. But more specifically, they want to decolonize the left. That is, to get what they term the white left to be more active in decolonizing its practices. In fact, the term the left is a Western European concept in itself, coming from the French Revolution. So they have asked that in this attempt to, work towards some kind of revolution from below, which is the general principle of all of the chapters, if that holds them together. There are people with different politics in the collection, but basically what connects them is the belief in revolution from below. So they're not state communists, they're not Leninists and those other types of the left who are more authoritarian in their approach. They wanted, as Indigenous women, to ask those in the white left to look more carefully, to acknowledge that colonization continues today, to make a choice to decenter the epistemic violence that accompanies it and recenter themselves in decolonizing practices, which is to say, when they talk about epistemic violence, there is the imposition of knowledge traditions even by the white left, who sees itself as fighting against the authoritarian structures, against capitalism and colonialism and so forth. So even on the white left, you have the importation of colonialist ideas, of certain forms of racism, and the kind of, punitive measures against traditional knowledges. And that's something that people on the left have to work to reverse to the best of their ability. We chose to lead the collection with that essay because it recognized something across the global north and global south, the kind of anti-racist practices, especially in indigenous forms of resistance, that would create a kind of common bond between the sections of the book in global north and global south. Otherwise, we were working with trying to get a sense that poverty doesn't look the same everywhere, and so there are specific enunciations of this from people in the global north versus people in the global south. So I guess I should stop and okay. So maybe we'll get a chance later to talk about this. Callie Acuno is one of the contributors. He's developing something called Cooperation Jackson in the southern United States, and this is the kind of project that I think is representative of what we hope revolutionaries will aspire to. The kind of organizing that's necessary. We wanted to place an emphasis on organization. Much of the left right now is doing mobilizing. So as fun as it might be to show up and punch a Nazi or something, we need organizational capacity in the long run. It's the only way that we will win is with organizational capacity and building it for the long term. So I think I'll just, I guess, stop there, and if there's interest, we can talk about it later.
Folks, I'm going to turn it over to our panelists, but I'd just like to notice, many of you must have noticed, we've been joined by our final panelist. Katherine Martin is a part of the panel tonight, and we thank Katherine for joining us. Katherine Martin was the former Nancy's chair, or is the former Nancy's chair, immediately preceding Lynn Jones, so we have two of our Nancy's chairs at the same table. Katherine is an award-winning filmmaker, a Mi'kmaq activist and scholar and educator with tons of activist experience as well. So she rounds out our panel. We thank her so much for joining us. I won't put her on the spot. We were just going to go down the table. Do you want to start, Kathy?
Sure,
Is that okay?
Yes.
Okay. We will just move this way. And you're welcome to sit or stand. Don't feel the need to use the lectern if you don't want to.
Oh, wow, I didn't think this many people would come. I just came from the Halifax explosion exhibit at Dell. It's awesome. And there was a lot of people there. What, there's nothing to do these days? Okay, my name's Katherine Martin, I welcome you all to the unceded Mi'kmaq territory, to the land of the Onu. That's who we really are. Mi'kmaq comes from Nogama, which means our relatives, and somehow from Nogama, the French and the British called us Mi'kmaq. So there we are. Something you probably didn't know. And I'm here, I just came from the explosion exhibit, the walking tour exhibit. It's been an awesome experience because I've been with them a lot. So if you have a chance, please go over there. And Alex assured me that we were going to be at Dow. So I was just going to zip over to the next place, but we changed.
So many things going on.
So I'd like to thank our guest and welcome you to the territory. And, you have a key to the city, if you like. I don't know where you'll get it, but you're welcome to use this city to share it with all of us. So the drum, as many of you know by now, because many of you have been here with me, represents the heartbeat of Mother Earth, and the heartbeat of Mother Earth is having a hard time beating because of all of the destruction that is happening on her and to her. It also represents the heartbeat of our mothers. So sometimes when you hear this, you think, I don't know why that drum brings me to this, I don't know where. It brings you back into your mom's womb. And that is the heartbeat of your mother. It's also our first language to all of us. And we in the Mi'kmaq, and when you're on our territory, we ask you to do the same, to speak from your hearts. And when you do that, you're not only speaking the language of your mother, but you're speaking the truth, because her language is the truth. Your mom didn't let you lie, did she? I lied right in front of my mom today. She was here doing basket making, and I said something. She said, "That's not true." Oh my God. Anyway, it's been a nice day, and I'm going to just welcome you all with not the one I usually welcome with. It's telling me to do something else. So this is something Sara Denny taught me to sing whenever into my introduction. This drum, because I'm hearing a whole bunch of questions in people's minds. Where did she get the drum and who made it? It's made by Todd Labrador from Wildcat down near Kedgie. And it's moose hide and it's a loon. Was there somebody thinking that out there? Anyway, it's a great drum, and he gifted it to me one day. We were passing one another on some back road because we had to switch something with birch bark or something, and he gave me this drum. So I'm gonna, 3 minutes, 5 minutes? Yeah, we're doing like a little opening number right now, what is about poverty and things like that. Yeah. And then we're gonna be moderated. Okay. We're going to open it up to the people and we're going to talk. Okay. So, interesting panel discussion tonight, and I look forward to reading the book. Been at a couple book launches this past week, so I don't know how I'm going to read them all since I'm a terrible reader. I was thinking on my way, okay, poverty, okay. Halifax explosion, no, poverty, okay. Well, the Halifax explosion on December 6th, 1917 was one of the many, many examples of poverty imposed upon the people of this, the first people of this land. We were here for 14,000 years, living a pretty good life until about 500-ish years ago, when new peoples who had, they weren't the first peoples that came here, and I'm not going to give you proof why, but there were other peoples that had the same idea, take a boat and travel around the coastlines. But this group came and imposed a value system and a way of life that didn't fit with our land and the way of life that had been existing for 14,000 years. So in 500 years, the new people managed to almost destroy our people with policy. And policies impoverished us. Laws that were forced upon us, even though we had rights under our Treaty of Peace and Friendship, yet they were not acknowledged, and imposed systems that you would not believe happened in this country to the people who shared the land and opened it to all the people. And I ask you to look at those policies and see how policy and laws and imposed values and other people's way of lives being imposed on an ancient system where we worked out quite well how to balance the ecology, how to keep the environment intact. We knew all of this for 14,000 years, and the new people who came here had no idea and did all of what they did to what we're seeing today. And I don't need to go down to that road. But what is poverty? In my life, it's the obvious. It's the violation of our human rights as First Nations people, which has caused us to be impoverished. It's the lack of acknowledging our rights under our treaties and under our human rights. So before we start talking about money and food and stuff, all of these policies have been imposed upon us that has caused poverty, because our way of life was working and living off the land, from the land, and happily without money, just with trading and with sharing. And then when the new peoples came and laws started being put on top of us, even after we signed a peace and friendship treaty that said, we're not conquered people, we have given you nothing. We have not given up our land, anything. We're just signing this peace and friendship treaty because we're going to say, yeah, we'll try to get along, because we haven't been. But that even wasn't acknowledged. So how do some people become impoverished? Well, material-wise, the lack of resources being provided to us, where we were no longer allowed to cut down trees, to make our baskets, no longer to go on the lands that we freely went on to get our wood, no longer allowed to speak our language, no longer allowed to dance, to do ceremonies without being fined and jailed, no longer allowed to hunt when we needed to hunt to feed our families or fish. And that was under this peace and friendship agreement that nobody would acknowledge, yet they enforced for 250 some years here, until in the 90s when the Supreme Court of Canada said, oh, hi, by the way, this is valid, and it always was. So I have known through my own experience, knowing my dad's family especially, who were the poorest of the poor in Millbrook, and they hunted and fished until he died. I mean, he wasn't poor when he died, but he certainly suffered, along with my great-grandparents on both sides, trying to feed themselves and their families and keep their homes warm. So poverty has been for at least 250 years, and prior to that, something we in this country, all Indigenous peoples, probably have experienced. I only can tell you about our story. Now, if I talk to Sarah Francis and I say, you know, in the 1930s or 40s when you were a young person, or Mary Brooks, who's passed on, you know, how did you survive? And she said, we didn't survive, we lived. And we were so happy, and we didn't think we were poor, because we had fish. We could catch fish right out of Boat Harbor with their hands for breakfast. That was richness. Sara Denny, an elder from Eskasoni, said, you and many, many people before this have said, the number of children you have is how wealthy you are. So when you have many, many children, you are rich. So I guess I'm just going to end it with saying that as a Mi'kmaq person, so many of the new ways of thinking what is rich have nothing to do with what we think is rich. Violation of our human rights is a different story. And the violation of our human rights, we only were given our human rights maybe 5 years ago in Canada. It's true. You know, taking our children from our communities, stealing them, selling them, putting them in residential schools and totally abusing them and traumatizing generations to this day is poverty. When you take our children, you have taken our riches, because they are the most sacred. So right now, that's where I'm at. The Halifax explosion, I never do this. I was singing to open the explosion exhibit. And for one moment, I thought of my great-grandparents, Sarah and Joe Cope, and all of their 12 children who were at the house on the Dartmouth side when the explosion happened. And they lost one child in the explosion, a 12-year-old. Another one died just after the explosion. He was like young, he had burns. My great-grandma and her daughter and her baby, Anne, died about 6 months after from the effects of the explosion, and they had been in a hospital. And his sons, one of them was killed in World War I within that next 8 months. That is poverty to me, the loss of life. And the loss of life that because of environmental racism, because of locations, because people wanted to move us out of where we were because we were unsightly, that was the perception of Tufts Cove and Albro Lake people. So our people were fighting to get out of there because they weren't wanted there and they needed a better life. And because the government fought for 3 years not to move us, and the communities on either side were racist and didn't want us there, we couldn't move to where we were supposed to, and we were told to leave where we were. And if the government was going to move us after 3 years that next week, we wouldn't have had that devastation. And we were only living in wigwams. So poverty, it's the depth of it, I couldn't even begin to tell you. But today, that has not changed. And it doesn't take much for everyone to just turn on a TV, Google a few reservations across this country that the government built on us, for us, imposed upon us, and then gave us no good water and not good houses. And that we are in, as Trudeau says, 2017. And finally, with just remembering that the Commission for the Missing and Murdered Women is coming at the end of the month to Nova Scotia as an inquiry. We are impoverished because of the huge loss of our women and children and girls and men, and the overpopulation in prisons, social issues, but also the huge number. They're saying now 4,000 cases are being identified from the original 500. So what else is impoverishing us? I hope that we find out a little bit from the rest, but just now I heard on the way here between those two places that the Harper government cut so many programs on women that now there's a huge increase in women in prison. And they're feeling safe when they get to prison. Like there's something completely wrong here. And women and children are the givers of life. So if you lose that sacredness, you are very poor. So there I go.
Thanks so much, Katherine. Turn things over to Jackie Barkley now.
Okay, I'm going to try to speak loud, which I usually get accused of doing. No, there's no mic. But is it easier to hear if I stand up? Yeah? Okay, somebody's saying yes. So I'll do that.
Funner. It's more funner.
Read off a piece of paper.
Oh, yeah. It's
Okay, I'm going to really try hard not to spill my Diet Pepsi on your computer.
good idea.
All right, so Alex, I timed this. I think it's 8.5. Little linear, little European there, but anyway. All right, so I took your question literally, but first of all, I really want to thank you for inviting me. Alex seems to think that I don't enjoy coming and talking, but I do, and I'm really honored to be with this panel. These are people who are real fighters, and I'm honored to be a part of this group. I'm a member of Solidarity Halifax, and I'm going to try to speak in a way that reflects the work that we're trying to do, and why at this stage in my own efforts, I'm involved in this particular way to struggle against capitalism together with others. I wasn't really sure what the poor meant in this question, so I want to start my comments by speculating on different ways of understanding what this could mean. So if by poor, we mean those with the very least money, income security, or housing, or food on the table, then in my view, the answer has directly to do with not having money, or security, or a house, or food on the table. That's really pretty straightforward. As a social worker, I know a lot of people in that category, and rising up is sometimes just one more exhaustion, one more fear of consequences and further oppression. To be clear, that doesn't mean that people in this grouping don't rise up. Fight for 15 in Ontario, unemployed workers, Mothers United for Metro Shelter in Nova Scotia, Mothers on Income Assistance, all rise up frequently, but usually for short-term and specifically urgent goals. I'm talking here only about Canada, not about struggles of the most economically oppressed all over the world, which is a different context. If by poor is meant the employed or unionized working class and communities that have been oppressed by race and nation, that group actually rises up very frequently. The struggle of the Chronicle Herald Union over a year and a half here, Black Lives Matter, the fishermen's strike, the history of Cape Breton miners, the teachers' struggle recently, Idle No More, the resistance in Elsipogtog, the Stonewall riots, the Rainbow Railroad, the anti-fascist movements in Boston, in Charlottesville, in Standing Rock. The list is actually endless and very inspiring. Can you hear me?
Absolutely.
Okay. Yeah, but you're right there.
Is the window good?
I'm good.
Can you hear her way back there?
Yes, we can.
Okay. So if by poor and if by rising up, what we mean is why are not organized people, including those of us in this room, rising up to challenge the state and economic power of capitalism? That's a more complicated question to me, and we have to answer it for ourselves and with others and analyze it collectively for a greater chance of success. So the questions are, when do people rise up? Who rises up? Where? And for what purpose? These are necessary variables in answering the question, why are we not yet rising up? I'll try to take a small look at why I think the larger broad movement against capitalism is not yet sufficiently mobilized to rise up at this time. And here I want to get very down to earth and speak from my heart about the experiences that I see. Number one, punishment as individuals. Some people in this room, and many we each know, have experienced the consequences of speaking out without collective support and structure. Consequences borne by some of us here or affecting our families' well-being with painful, psychological, isolating, medical, and financial results. And on another level, brutal state repression against rebellions. We see examples of state-sanctioned or organized killing, William Davis in Cape Breton, incarceration for 2 years in Dorchester for J.B. McLaughlin, the relentless police killing of young black men, the arrests of elders recently in Labrador for their protest, and a killing on a picket line that I remember at a Robin Hood flower plant in Quebec in the 70s, to name just a tiny number of examples of a very long and horrific list. Number two, what keeps us from rising up? Individualism. Capitalism's insidious and universal seduction to the isolated and autonomous self. It is so prevalent and so poured daily into our brains that working together is thought of as a quaint artifact of union strikes, disasters, and wars. We are influenced daily to be annoyed, frustrated, angry, and hopeless about being able to agree, about being able to tolerate meetings, about being together for organizational and collective challenges that are required for the long view. Short-term, intense resistance, people in the street, the feeling of collectivity is wonderful, but it is insufficient to combat individualism at its core. The third one is anti-intellectualism. We are all intellectuals, which is different from being academics or different from our level of education. The culture of contemporary capitalism encourages us all to reduce complex questions to the lowest common denominator while implying that only those with time and educational privilege can talk about and think about big ideas regarding economics, sociology, history, and culture. And this is a hard one. How does the long, hard ideological struggle for revolutionary change in our ideas compete with the enormous corporate control of and financial resources of the print media, of Facebook, let's remember who owns it, of Twitter? Through these, capitalism seduces us into instant emotional and political gratification, and pop-up organizing of quick demos and 10-second petition signatures. Facebook organizing can be useful, but it is never a substitute for the collective development of long-term strategy. The sophisticated tools of modern communication drown us in a shallow, superficial, simplistic, racist, sexist junk food for the brain. 4, the medicalization of our pain. By this I mean two different kinds of issues. On the one hand, capitalism has more than one way to kill and maim, which has already been brought up tonight. As we see huge heart disease, diabetes, lung conditions, and many other conditions proliferate in the lives of the most oppressed people among us. But there's another medicalization that divides us, and by that, it's that we are assaulted with the sheer weight of diagnoses of so-called mental illness. Diagnoses which suggest that the social conditions of alienation, of poor housing, of unlivable incomes, of isolation, of sexual and racial oppression are, we are led to believe, really psychiatric disorders, which require being drugged or talked into submission or convincing us that our suffering is biological, deterministic, and inescapable. And I'm a therapist, so I just kind of went there for a minute. All of us here could list a lot more, but these are the four that came to my mind from my heart preparing for tonight. So I want to comment on what I think might contribute to resistance and rebellion, what I think I know might contribute. You don't have time for how much I don't know. So number one, continuity of commitment. Staying in the struggle for life. Not letting discouragement or frustration or anger with each other keep us from continuing to look for answers. For example, the struggle against enslavement took 400 years of determination and unbearable suffering. It isn't about us or our egos or our personal experience or our failures or our successes or even our lessons, but it is those of our ancestors, our predecessors, our own practice, and what we can offer to the next generation. In the words of Sweet Honey in the Rock, we who believe in freedom cannot rest. Number two, organizing to practice. And what I mean is as in a sport or musical instrument. Practice daily how to be in solidarity and combat individualism. Practice ways of designing and sustaining organizational structures that can be both effective and democratic, inclusive and focused, and in which we can learn how to stay together while agreeing and disagreeing. Three, learning from the past while not getting stuck in ways of organizing and mobilizing that have no popular resonance and wind up only talking to the converted, to our friends, and to whomever is like whoever I am. Four, we need to defend each other and show up, and then keep showing up, and then keep learning from each other. Always trying to create the conditions for more unity, not perfect unity, but more. And finally, go to the mall. Go to the mall for creating political disturbance. The most inspiring experience of the last 10 years of my own life, and there actually have been quite a lot, I'm happy to say, was going with people in Idle No More to chant and speak and rebel at the Halifax shopping center. The demands for justice echoing, the demands for justice echoing loudly and forcefully in the modern temple of capitalism. Thank you. Our sheets on the table. Excellent.
Thank you so much, Jackie. Lynn?
Yeah, I'm gonna go over here. Would people like to stand or move your body for a second? Because it is hard. So take
I know.
Folks, while you're moving your bodies, which is a great idea, I forgot to do two things when we opened up, and that's just to thank our friends at Fernwood Publishing. They have a nice little book table at the back. You should take a look. if you're interested. Some new books for sale, some really interesting ones, and there are copies of Why Don't the Poor Rise Up for a discounted cost. There, I only was able to bring 9 copies tonight. I'm sorry, but you can buy them online from AK Press. You can order them through Bookmark, but please feel free. There's also literature, as Jackie just pointed out, circulating from different groups around here, so please take something on your way out as well, get that information.
So, thank you, everyone, especially the organizers, for inviting me to be part of this illustrious panel. When I was asked, I had stated, I'm doing I'm retired. I'm supposed to be retired, but I have a lot on my agenda these days, so I'm really hesitant about taking on more activities and engagement. So I was assured for this particular panel that I would be able to share experiences that I've already been through and have been a part of. So I didn't have to get into a long bit of research. I guess I am the research of that. So I do thank you, and I do ask that you bear with me, because I thought maybe I'd just share exactly as they told me, a few stories, a few activities that I've been involved in. I have a tendency, sometimes I could talk with you forever, because I love storytelling and I love connecting with people, my audience, and doing the back and forth and finding out where you're coming from, and sharing that kind of thing. So I'm the kind of person, I want to try to keep it really short tonight, but don't hesitate to just tell me to sit down, because it's not a problem. I had trouble with this question. Why don't the poor rise up? But you did explain, so I'm glad where that came up. I'm always I guess I'm protective. I grew up from a young age protective of other people, the poor, the animals, the persons with disabilities. I always seem to be in this role of protection. So you're picking on the poor. And that was my immediate response. Why did you say that? Like, the poor, they're getting in trouble too. So I had a bit of problem, so I couldn't really get my head around it. But I have a simple thing as to, I keep looking at this book over here in the title, Why Don't the Poor Rise Up? Well, to me, it's not, we're always making things so complicated and so in depth, and we've got to study and we've got to research and do all that. The poor may not rise up because they're just trying to survive. Like, it's just so simple. Is that they're just trying to live from day to day, put food on the table, look after the children, do whatever. And in doing that, maybe too, the rise up manifests itself in ways that we don't normally describe things, maybe. Maybe they're rising up